At 1 minute past 1 in the morning, on June 9th, 1944, in the black waters northeast of the Ile de Batz, a British radar operator aboard a cruiser saw the shape he had been waiting for. 4 contacts, moving in line, trying to slip past the western approaches of the English Channel toward the Normandy beaches, where the greatest invasion in history was entering its 4th day. On the bridge of a Canadian destroyer riding on the port flank of the flotilla, Commander Harry George DeWolf heard the report, felt the vibration of his engines climb as the throttle opened, and gave the order to close. Within minutes, the sea around him would be torn by gunfire, by the red arcs of tracer crossing the water, by columns of spray lifting higher than his own funnel. Within 4 hours, a 3,600-ton German destroyer would be burning on a French reef, its hull cut open by Canadian shells. Within a year, the ship under DeWolf's feet would be called the fightingest ship in Canadian naval history, and the title would belong to her, without contest, for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. That ship was Her Majesty's Canadian ship Haida. Haida was a tribal-class destroyer, built at the Vickers Armstrong's Naval Yard on the Tyne at Newcastle, upon Tyne in England. Her keel was laid on September 29, 1941. She was launched on August 25, 1942, and commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy on August 30, 1943. She displaced 1,927 long tons standard and 2,745 long tons deep-loaded. She measured 377 feet from stem to stern. 3 Admiralty, 3 drum boilers drove 2 Parsons-geared turbines, producing 44,000 shaft horsepower, and pushing her through the water at a designed 36.5 knots. She carried 6 4.7-inch guns in 3 twin mounts, arranged in the pattern known as A, B, and Y. A 4th mount, in the X position aft of the funnel, carried 2 4-inch anti-aircraft guns, rather than the main battery weapons, a change the Canadians had insisted on for their ships to give them a better chance against Luftwaffe aircraft. She carried a quadruple 2-pounder pom-pom, 20mm Oerlikon cannons for close-in defense, a quadruple 21-inch torpedo tube mount on her centerline, and depth charges on her stern. Her complement was 14 officers and 245 ratings, 259 men in total. The tribal class had been the pride of the Royal Navy before the war. Canada's Chief of the Naval Staff, Admiral Percy Nels, had seen them in 1938 and had decided he wanted them for his own navy. They were the largest, fastest, and most heavily armed destroyers afloat. Nels believed that without ships of this caliber, Canada's navy would slide back into the second-rate status it had held for most of the 1920s and 1930s, a coastal patrol force with no real voice in the councils of sea power. So Canada negotiated. In the winter of 1939 and 1940, the Canadian government and the British Admiralty struck a bargain. Canadian yards would build escort vessels for the Royal Navy. British yards would build tribals for the Royal Canadian Navy. The exchange did not work out cleanly, but 4 tribals were laid down in England for Canada. They were named Iroquois, Athabaskan, Huron, and Haida. In the years that followed, 4 more tribals would be built at Halifax for the Royal Canadian Navy, making a total of 8 Canadian tribals across the class. Only the 4 British-built ships would see service in the Second World War. Each ship carried the name of a First Nations people. It was the Royal Canadian Navy's way of marking these vessels as uniquely Canadian, tying them to the land they served. A deeper relationship between the Haida nation and the ship would grow over the decades that followed, but at the moment of her commissioning, Haida was a steel ship built in an English shipyard, carrying a name that meant something about who Canada was trying to become. She was not cheap. A British-built tribal cost on the order of $3 million. A Canadian-built one, at Halifax shipyards, would cost nearly 3 times that. This was money the Canadian government was willing to spend because it believed, as Nels did, that the Navy of the future had to be a balanced force, with cruisers, carriers, and modern destroyers, not only the small escorts that would actually do most of the real work of the war. When Haida was commissioned at Newcastle on August 30, 1943, Commander Harry George DeWolf stepped aboard as her first commanding officer. He was 40 years old, a Nova Scotian from the town of Bedford, a career officer who had entered the Royal Naval College of Canada in September 1918, in the shadow of the Halifax explosion the year before. He had commanded his first ship, the trawler Festubert, in 1930. He had taken the destroyer Saint Laurent to sea at the outbreak of war in 1939 and had reportedly fired the first Canadian naval shots of the Second World War during the evacuation of British and French troops from France. In 1940, that same summer, he had rescued approximately 860 survivors from the torpedoed liner Arandora Star. He had, according to naval legend, once ridden a live runaway torpedo across the deck of Saint Laurent to keep it from firing. He had reverted from his acting rank of captain to his substantive rank of commander to take Haida. His crew would come to call him Hard Over Harry, for the way he would throw the helm hard over under enemy fire, dodging shells and torpedoes by the sharpness of his turns. He suffered from chronic seasickness his entire career and reportedly slept propped up in his bunk. Even so, he was the best fighting captain the Royal Canadian Navy produced in the war, and in him the Haida had her decisive asset. The year was 1943, and the Second World War was at its turning point. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached its crisis in what the German U-boat arm called Black May. In that month, the Kriegsmarine lost 43 U-boats, 25% of its operational strength, and on May 24, Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered his boats temporarily withdrawn from the North Atlantic. The Allies had finally solved the convoy battle. Very long-range Liberator aircraft, escort carriers, centimetric radar, the lee light over the Bay of Biscay, high-frequency direction finding on every escort, and a new acoustic homing torpedo had turned the hunters into the hunted. But the war at sea was not won. In occupied France, the Germans still maintained powerful surface forces at the ports of Brest, La Pallice, and Saint-Nazaire. The 8th Destroyer Flotilla, with Narvik-class ships of 3,600 tons each, carrying 5 150mm guns, had firepower comparable to a light cruiser. The 4th Torpedo Boat Flotilla, with Elbing-class boats of about 1,750 tons, carrying 4 105mm guns and 6 torpedo tubes, had near-destroyer capability. These forces could lunge out at any moment into the approaches to the Channel, striking Allied convoys, striking the invasion shipping that was already gathering in southern English ports. The Allies knew this, and they had been bloodied by it. On the night of October 22 and 23, 1943, off the French port of Septiles, the British anti-aircraft cruiser Charybdis and the destroyer Limborn had been torpedoed by the 4th Torpedo Boat Flotilla. More than 440 men went to the bottom. The disaster forced the Royal Navy to reorganize its Channel striking force into a single standing flotilla, trained in night fighting, built around the hardest-hitting destroyers available. On January 10, 1944, the 10th Destroyer Flotilla was formed at Plymouth, under Captain Basil Jones of the Royal Navy, flying his pennant in the British Tribal Tartar. Its backbone would be Tribal-class destroyers, British, Canadian and Polish. Its mission would be to own the Western Channel by night. Haida joined this flotilla in January 1944, but before she did, she spent her first months of war in the frozen waters of the Arctic. Life aboard a tribal at war was not comfortable. The class had been designed for the North Sea, not for the Arctic, and even with the heating and ventilation improvements fitted to the Canadian ships, the mess decks were cold, cramped, and damp. 259 men lived in a hull 377 feet long. The ratings slept in hammocks, slung from deckhead hooks, stowed each morning, and rigged again at night. The officers had small cabins aft. The wardroom, where the officers ate, was larger than most cabins but smaller than a modest living room. The galley fed the crew in shifts. Fresh water was rationed for drinking and cooking. Washing was done in salt water with a special yellow soap that never really lathered. When the ship was at action stations, men stayed at their posts for hours, in heavy duffel coats if they were topside, in singlets and boiler suits if they were below in the boiler rooms, where the air temperature could climb above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Letters home were censored. Radio silence was often ordered. News of the war came, when it came, over the bridge broadcast from the commanding officer or from a gunnery officer reading an Admiralty signal aloud. And under it all ran the constant vibration of the turbines, the shudder of the hull in a seaway, and the knowledge that an enemy submarine or torpedo boat might be, at any moment, within range. In October 1943, assigned to the home fleet at Scapa Flow, Haida sailed as senior officer of a destroyer group covering the relief of the Spitsbergen garrison and the passage of Russian minesweepers to Murmansk. She escorted convoy JW-54A out of Loch Uy in mid-November. She escorted RA-54B home from Archangel in late November and early December, and in December she joined the ocean escort for convoy JW-55B, which would sail into one of the most famous naval engagements of the war. On Christmas Day, 1943, DeWolf wrote in his report of proceedings that Christmas Day was spent at sea under unusual conditions, in the Arctic, in bad weather and almost constant darkness, escorting a straggling convoy, shadowed and reported by enemy aircraft, with the Scharnhorst and an unknown number of U-boats in the vicinity. The next day, the German battleship Scharnhorst was destroyed at the Battle of the North Cape by the British battleship Duke of York under Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, and by the cruisers Belfast, Norfolk, and Sheffield. Haida did not engage Scharnhorst directly. She was stationed with the close escort of the merchant ships, too far away to reach the battle line. From that station, she and her Canadian sisters watched the glow of the engagement over the horizon. But the lesson of the convoy, that the Royal Canadian Navy could take its place with the home fleet in any weather, on any sea, had been delivered. On January 10, 1944, Haida and her sister Iroquois sailed south to Plymouth. The Arctic was behind her. The Channel lay ahead. For the first 3 months of 1944, the Tenth Destroyer Flotilla trained. Night fighting in the Channel was a specific and difficult art. The German ports could be reached in hours. The water was shallow and strewn with minefields. The coast was studded with shore batteries, and the enemy could choose his moment. Operation Tunnel was the codename for the anti-shipping sweeps. Operation Hostile was the codename for the mine-laying sorties. Between February and April, Haida flew through 10 tunnel patrols and 9 hostile operations. She exercised with Black Prince, with the Free Polish destroyers Błyskawica and Piorun, with the British tribals Tartar and Ashanti, with her Canadian sisters Athabaskan and Huron. The art of these sweeps depended on 3 technologies working together. The first was radar. Centimetric radar in the tribals could detect a destroyer-sized target at roughly 15,000 yards in good conditions. The second was the plotting table in the operations room below the bridge, where bearings and ranges were worked into a live tactical picture. The third was the illumination round, the star shell, fired from the 4-inch mount to light up the sea under a slow-falling parachute flare. At the moment of illumination, the flotilla knew exactly what it was facing, and the main battery could be brought to bear on gun flashes before the enemy's eyes had adjusted to the sudden light. The Germans had learned to counter these tactics. Their Elbing-class boats could make more than 33 knots. Their Narvik-class destroyers carried radar of their own and could fire salvos from 5 main guns at ranges comparable to a light cruiser. Both classes carried heavy torpedo batteries, and their standard night-fighting doctrine was to fire torpedoes on radar bearing and turn away before the enemy could close. A well-handled German flotilla could, on paper, inflict serious damage on the 10th Destroyer Flotilla. The problem for the Germans was fuel, training time, and the pressure of constant Allied air patrols that made every daylight transit of the Biscay approaches a risk. By the spring of 1944, the Kriegsmarine's surface arm was brittle. It had the hardware. It did not have the seasoned crews or the sea time. On the evening of April 25, 1944, radar intelligence flagged a movement of the 4th torpedo boat, flotilla, 3 Elbing-class boats, T-29, T-27, and T-24, under Korvettenkapitän Franz Kolauf. Force 26 sortied to intercept. The cruiser Black Prince led, with Haida, Athabaskan, Ashanti, and Huron in company. Contact came late that night and ran into the early hours of April 26 off the Ile de Batz. The British cruiser fired star shell. The Germans turned for their bases. T-27, hit early in the action, broke away toward Morlaix. T-24 took damage and fled toward St. Malo. T-29, the flotilla flagship carrying Kolauf himself, was caught by the combined gunfire of Haida, Athabaskan, Ashanti, and Huron. Shell after shell struck her. She slowed, she burned, and finally she rolled over and sank. Kolauf was killed aboard his ship. The Naval Historical Section of the Royal Canadian Navy would record that this was the first time Canadian ships had destroyed an enemy warship of destroyer size in surface action. It was a line that meant something. for a navy that had spent most of its existence convinced it would never have the chance. 3 nights later came the action that would define Haida's legend, not for her kills, but for what her captain chose to do after the shooting stopped. On the night of April 28 and 29, 1944, T-24 and T-27, which had survived the earlier engagement, tried to slip from St. Malo back to Brest. Haida and Athabaskan were covering a mine-laying sweep off the Ile de Batz on the Brittany coast. They detected the Germans. They closed to attack. At approximately 4:17 in the morning on April 29, a torpedo from T-24 struck Athabaskan. The Canadian destroyer's stern exploded. Fire raced through her. She began to sink. Haida drove on, put shells into T-27, and forced her aground on a reef off Pointe de Pontusval near Kerlouan, where she was later finished off by motor torpedo boat 673 of the Royal Navy. Athabaskan was gone. 128 of her men were dead, including her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander John Hamilton Stubbs. Approximately 83 would be taken prisoner by German minesweepers that came out from Brest at first light. The rest were in the water, covered in fuel oil, many burned, many injured, crying out in the darkness. And here DeWolf made the decision that historians would debate and admire for the rest of his life. The Brittany coast was lit by the dawn. German shore batteries were within range. The Luftwaffe was within minutes of arrival. The book said Haida should withdraw, save herself, and report the loss. DeWolf chose otherwise. He held Haida in the rescue position, put scramble nets over the side, and fished his countrymen out of the oil. For 16 minutes, by his own reckoning, he stayed. 42 men came up those nets alive. 2 of his own sailors were swept off the nets by the sea. When the Dawn would not hold any longer, he ordered a single motor cutter lowered. Leading seaman William Arthur McClure, stoker William Alfred Cummings, and able seaman Jack Hannam stayed behind, in an open boat, to continue pulling Athabaskan survivors out of the water while their own ship fled for the horizon. Haida sailed north. The motor cutter crew kept working. They pulled 6 more Athabaskan men aboard and picked up the 2 Haida sailors who had been washed overboard. When a German minesweeper came out of Brest, they hid. When enemy fighters strafed them, they returned fire with a stripped machine gun. When their engine failed, they rowed. Late on the afternoon of April 29, Spitfires of the Royal Air Force spotted them. An air-sea rescue launch brought them home to Penzance that night. McClure and Cummings were each awarded a mention in dispatches. DeWolf was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for gallantry and distinguished service as senior officer of destroyers in successful destroyer night actions in the English Channel on April 26 and April 29, 1944. Citations that covered both the sinking of T-29 and his decision to stand into enemy waters to save Canadian lives. That rescue, more than any kill, is what made Haida's reputation. A ship of war that turned toward her wounded, under the guns of the enemy, and did not leave until she had to. But the fighting was not over. The fighting had barely begun. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. Within 48 hours, the German Naval Group Command West ordered the 8th Destroyer Flotilla to sail from the Gironde to the Channel to attack the invasion fleet. Z-32, Z-24, the former Dutch destroyer ZH-1, and the Elbing T-24 steamed for Brest. A coastal command Beaufighter strike lightly damaged Z-32 on the way. The Germans paused at Brest, strengthened their anti-aircraft armament, and sortied again on the evening of June 8, under the tactical command of Kapitein zur See Theodor von Bechtolsheim, aboard Z-32. The 10th Destroyer Flotilla was waiting. Ultra-intercepts had given Captain Basil Jones time to organize his force. He split it into 2 divisions, Tartar, Ashanti, Haida, and Huron in one, Eskimo, Javelin, Blyskawika, and Piorun in the other. At about 1 minute past 1 in the morning on June 9, radar found the enemy northeast of the Ile de Batz. Tartar fired star shell. The night came apart in a confusion of starlight, gun flashes, and torpedo wakes. Tartar took several hits from Z-32's 15-centimeter guns. Fires broke out in her rigging and on her bridge, but her damage control teams contained them, and she kept steaming. Ashanti and Tartar closed with ZH-1. At point-blank range, Ashanti fired 2 torpedoes. One of them blew the bow clean off the Dutch-built destroyer. Her captain, Korvettenkapitein Klaus Barkow, ordered the crew to abandon ship and set scuttling charges. At 2:40 in the morning, ZH-1 sank. 39 of her men were killed, including Barkow himself. Meanwhile, Haida and Huron had turned after Z-24 and T-24. The two Germans fled east at high speed and, deliberately, turned into a British minefield. The Canadians did not follow. By the time they had worked around the mines, their quarry was gone. At roughly 5 in the morning, the radar on Haida's bridge picked up a single large contact. Z-32, separated from her consorts, had lost her way in the confusion and was steaming roughly south, trying to reach St. Malo. Haida and Huron closed. After a moment of identification, because both Canadian destroyers and their enemy had similar silhouettes at that range, the Canadians opened fire. Shells struck Z-32's after turbine room. Her forward gun turret was disabled. Only her third turret was able to reply. She fired her last 2 torpedoes. Both missed. At 5:15, her starboard engine failed. Von Bechtolsheim ordered Korvettenkapitein Georg Ritter von Berger to run her aground on the Ile de Batz. Von Berger obeyed. At 20 minutes past 5 in the morning, Z-32 rammed the rocks and came to rest, her decks on fire, her guns silenced. Haida and Huron stood off and poured shells into the wreck for 10 more minutes to make sure. Approximately 20 of Z-32's crew were killed. Royal Air Force Beaufighters completed her destruction the following day. Z-24 and T-24 reached Brest alive. Their reprieve was temporary. On August 24, 1944, a combined strike by Royal Air Force 236 Squadron and Royal Canadian Air Force 404 Squadron caught them in port at Le Verdon and destroyed both. The Battle of Ushant, as the June 9 action came to be called, had eliminated the last major German surface threat to the Normandy beachhead. Haida did not stop. On June 24, 1944, she and the British destroyer Eskimo were patrolling roughly 30 miles south of Land's End. A Liberator of Czechoslovakian 311 Squadron of the Royal Air Force spotted a surfaced U-boat and attacked it with depth charges. The Liberator damaged the boat and forced it to dive shallow. Haida and Eskimo came on at full speed. They began their own pattern of depth charge attacks. After several runs, the U-boat, unable to control her depth, came back to the surface. It was U-971, a Type 7C, under Oberleutnant zur See Walter Zeppelin. Haida and Eskimo opened fire with everything they had. Zeppelin ordered the crew to abandon ship. U-971 sank. 52 of her 53 men were recovered by the 2 destroyers and the aircraft. Eskimo took 46 of them aboard. Haida took the last 6. A signal came from Black Prince, intercepted on the flotilla wireless, dry in tone and final in judgment. Narviks, Elbings and submarines all seemed to come alike. On the night of July 14 and 15, 1944, Haida and the Polish destroyer Błyskawica caught a German group off the Ile de Gros near Lorient. They destroyed 2 submarine chasers, UJ-1420 and UJ-1421, converted French trawlers pressed into German service, along with a merchant ship, and set 2 other vessels on fire. On the night of August 5 and 6, 1944, as part of Operation Kinetic, Force 26 swept north of the Ile d'Eu on the French coast. The force included the cruiser Bellona as senior officer, the British tribals Tartar and Ashanti, and the Canadian tribals Haida and Iroquois. They found a German coastal convoy south of Saint-Nazaire. They attacked just after midnight. Within the hour, the minesweeper M263 was sunk, the minesweeper M486 was sunk, the patrol boat V414 was sunk. The coastal launch Otto was sunk. Several merchant ships in the convoy were destroyed, and one of the armed escorts was damaged and finished off by a Royal Air Force strike later the same day. And in the middle of that one-sided victory, Haida took her only blood of the Second World War. None of the Allied ships were hit by the enemy. But as Y turret was being loaded, a shell detonated in the breech of one of its guns. Fire ripped through the mount. 2 of her gunners were killed. 8 others were wounded. The turret was knocked out of action for the rest of the engagement. A rating who fought the fire and saved his shipmates received the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal, only the second ever awarded to the Royal Canadian Navy in its history. The first had gone to Chief Petty Officer Max Bernays in 1942 aboard the destroyer Assiniboine for conwork in the ramming and destruction of U-210. DeWolf received the Distinguished Service Cross for the Battle of Ushant, citing by name the destruction of Z-32 and ZH-1. By the time Haida sailed for Halifax on September 22, 1944, the books were settled. The official Canadian tally, affirmed by the Royal Canadian Navy, by Parks Canada, by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada on the plaque it would later place at her side, and by the leading naval historians of the country, was that Haida had helped sink 14 enemy vessels. Her cumulative surface tonnage destroyed was greater than that of any other ship in the history of the Royal Canadian Navy. No other vessel in the service came close. That is what the phrase fightingest ship means. It is not folklore. It is a bookkeeping judgment grounded in specific engagements, specific dates, and specific names of ships on the seabed. When she arrived back at Halifax on September 29, 1944, the welcome was tumultuous. The crews of every ship in the harbour lined their rails. She had become the face of a navy that had, at last, found itself. She was not finished. In January 1945, under a new captain, Acting Lieutenant Commander Robert Philip Welland, she returned to Plymouth. In March, she was at Scapa Flow for operations off Norway. In April and May, she escorted convoys JW-66 and RA-66 to and from Murmansk, evading U-boat torpedoes in what would be among the Royal Canadian Navy's last engagements of the European War. On June 10, 1945, she arrived at Halifax with Huron and Iroquois. A refit for the Pacific was begun and abandoned when Japan surrendered in August. On March 20, 1946, she was paid off into reserve. It is worth pausing here on what the numbers mean. The Royal Canadian Navy went to war in 1939 with 13 warships and a few thousand sailors. By the end of the war, it was the third largest navy in the world, with more than 300 fighting ships and over 100,000 personnel. It had escorted the Atlantic convoys that kept Britain in the war. It had lost 31 ships and 1,990 men killed. It had sunk, or helped sink, 33 U-boats and roughly 42 enemy surface vessels. Most of those surface kills belonged to a small number of ships in a small number of engagements. Haida, in 8 months, accounted for a disproportionate share of them. She was the only Canadian ship to make a career of offensive surface warfare, because she was in the only Canadian formation committed to it. Her reputation, her nickname, and her record all flowed from that single fact. Everyone else was escorting. Haida was hunting. When peace came, Haida rested, but not for long. In June 1950, the Korean War began. The Royal Canadian Navy was called to contribute destroyers to the United Nations fleet. Haida was recalled from accommodation duty and sent into a long modernization refit that stretched from July 1950 to March 1952. When she came out, she was a different ship. Her forward 4.7-inch mounts were replaced by the 4-inch guns in the A and B positions. Her aft 4-inch mount was replaced by an American pattern twin 3-inch 50-caliber gun. Squid triple-barrel anti-submarine mortars were fitted aft. Single 40mm Bofors guns replaced the 20mm Oerlikons. A lattice mast carried new radar. She was reclassified as a destroyer escort, pennant number DE-215. On March 15, 1952, she was recommissioned at Halifax. She became the first Canadian warship commissioned under the sovereignty of Queen Elizabeth II. Her commanding officer was Commander Dun Lantier, a former Athabaskan officer who had survived the sinking of April 1944 as a prisoner of war in Germany. The symmetry was complete. The man taken captive off the Ile Vierge now commanded the ship that had, 8 years earlier, fought so hard to save his own. She departed Halifax on September 27, 1952, transited the Panama Canal in October, and arrived at the United Nations forward base at Sasebo, Japan, on November 12, 1952. She joined Task Force 95, the United Nations blockade force, patrolling the Korean coasts, bombarding shore targets, and hunting supply traffic. And here she joined a club no one had heard of before the war began, the Trainbusters Club. The North Korean rail lines along both coasts ran so close to the sea that a destroyer, if bold enough and lucky enough, could catch a train in her sights during the moments when a tunnel opened onto the shore. United States Navy ships had begun it in the summer of 1952. Task Force 95 formalized the competition. The rule was strict. The opening shell had to kill the locomotive. A damaged engine, towed away, did not count. 28 trains, in total, would be officially destroyed by United Nations ships across the entire war. On December 6, 1952, off the port of Yongdo, Haida and the American destroyer USS Moore shelled factory buildings and marshalling yards at Songjin on the east coast. A North Korean 76mm shore battery opened fire. The after 3-inch 50 silenced it. Haida began hunting trains. She missed several through that winter. On January 29, 1953, north of Rouen, she destroyed her first confirmed train. She was in the club. On May 26, 1953, at 20 minutes past 11 at night, she caught a full train near Tanchamp. Her first salvo hit the locomotive dead center. It exploded and toppled onto its side. The cars behind it spilled along the track. For 3 hours, Haida's guns hammered the wreckage. On May 29, a third train entered her sights, south of Songjin. The engine uncoupled itself from the cars and raced into a tunnel before the opening shell could reach it. Haida destroyed everything left on the track behind it. Because the locomotive itself had escaped, the Trainbusters Club rules awarded her a half credit. On the way back to her base at Pyongyangdo, she sank a drifting anti-ship mine with small arms fire. Her first Korean tour ended on June 12, 1953. She had logged 6 East Coast patrols and 3 West Coast patrols, 217 days in theatre, and 2.5 trains officially destroyed. Commander Lantier was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Petty Officer Ralph Smith received a mention in dispatches. She came home by way of the Suez Canal, completing the first circumnavigation of her career, and reached Halifax on July 22, 1953. The Korean armistice was signed 5 days later. The Royal Canadian Navy's trainbusters total for the entire war was 8. Haida contributed 2.5. Her sister HMCS Crusader contributed 4, including 3 in 24 hours, making Crusader the overall champion of the entire competition. The remainder went to the second HMCS Athabaskan. Proportionally, the Royal Canadian Navy had the highest ratio of trains destroyed of any navy in the fleet. Haida sailed on a second Korean tour on December 14, 1953, under Commander John Charles. She transited the Pacific westward this time, through Panama, Long Beach, Pearl Harbor, Kwajalein, and Guam, arriving at Sasebo on February 5, 1954. The armistice had held. Her role now was enforcement and presence. She conducted port visits to Otaru in Japan and to Manila in the Philippines. On September 12, 1954, she sailed for home a day early to outrun Typhoon June. Lieutenant Commander Marc Milner brought her from Hong Kong by way of Singapore, Ceylon, Bombay, Aden, Naples, Gibraltar, and Bermuda. She arrived at Halifax on November 1, 1954. The second tour had another side, one that rarely appears in combat histories but deserves remembering. Haida's chaplain, a priest the men called Father Murphy, organized parties aboard ship for Korean and Japanese war orphans during visits to forward ports. Sailors who had been, months earlier, firing 4-inch shells into North Korean coastal rail lines now spent their afternoons serving cake and pouring fruit juice for children who had lost everything to the war. It was a small thing. It was not in any operational plan, but the men who did it remembered it for the rest of their lives, and it belongs to the record of the ship as surely as any gun action. In doing so, she became the only ship in the Royal Canadian Navy to circumnavigate the globe twice. After Korea, Haida joined Task Group 301.1 with the aircraft carrier Magnificent and the destroyer Micmac on Caribbean cruises, Bermuda exercises, and voyages to Portsmouth in England. On August 8, 1955, she joined the newly formed 1st Canadian Destroyer Squadron. She exercised with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization fleet in the September 1955 Sea Enterprise exercise off Norway. She went through further refits in 1958, 1959, and 1960. Structural corrosion was surveyed in May 1960. A farewell tour of the Great Lakes in the summer of 1963 preceded the end. She was paid off on October 11, 1963, at HMCS Protector in Sydney, Nova Scotia. Her career log recorded 688,534.25 nautical miles, steamed 27 times around the world. And then, as has happened to so many warships that deserved better, Crown Assets announced that she would be scrapped. A small group of Canadians refused to let it happen. They incorporated themselves as Haida Incorporated. The group was led by a former Royal Canadian Navy rating named Neil Bruce and included the journalist Peter Ward, along with Norm Simpson, David Kidd, and Alan Howard. They raised money. They bid $20,000 on the ship, on the condition that she be restored and put on public display. The bid was accepted. She was towed from Marine Industries Limited at Sorel in Quebec to Toronto by 2 tugs, with a skeleton crew from HMCS York, the Toronto Naval Reserve Division. She arrived at Pier 6 at the foot of York Street at midnight, the planned civilian welcome having been cancelled because she was running late. On August 25, 1964, she was formally handed over. The guests of honour were 3 of her former captains: retired Vice Admiral Harry DeWolf, Rear Admiral Robert Philip Welland, and Commodore John Charles. They walked her decks together. She opened to the public in August 1965 as a floating museum, a maritime memorial, and a sea cadet training ship. In 1970, the province of Ontario acquired her and moved her to Ontario Place, on the Toronto waterfront, where she would sit for the next 32 years. In 1984, the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada designated her a National Historic Site of Canada. The plaque they placed at her side credited her with helping to sink 14 enemy vessels, the highest total of any Canadian warship in history. In 1989, a national charity, the Friends of HMCS Haida, was founded to support her. By the year 2000, the hull was in crisis. After decades in the brackish water of Lake Ontario, her steel was failing. Parks Canada announced its purchase of the ship on December 18, 2001, with the title formally transferred the following year. Extensive hull repairs, costing roughly $5 million, were carried out at Port Weller dry docks. On August 30, 2003, exactly 60 years to the day after her commissioning at Newcastle, she arrived at Pier 9 in Hamilton Harbour, next to the Naval Reserve Division HMCS Star. Approximately 10,000 people lined the harbour to watch her come home, the largest crowd in the harbour's history. The Honourable Sheila Copps presided. Jim DeWolf, son of the first commanding officer, spoke. A planned 11-gun salute was reduced to 5. She reopened to the public in June 2004. She remains there today, at 658 Catherine Street North, at Pier 9, Hamilton, Ontario, in her post-Korean War destroyer escort configuration. The forward 4.7-inch mounts are gone. The 3-inch 50 is aft. The squid mortars sit where depth charges once did, but the lines are the lines of a tribal, unchanged since Newcastle. 27 tribal-class destroyers were built for the Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Royal Australian Navy between 1937 and 1945. 13 were sunk in the Second World War. The remaining 13 were scrapped after the war. Haida is the only one left, anywhere in the world. Her captains grew old and went to their rest. Harry DeWolf was promoted to Vice Admiral and served as Chief of the Naval Staff from January 16, 1956 until July 31, 1960. Before formally retiring from the Royal Canadian Navy in May 1961, he lived to see the end of the 20th century. He died at the age of 97 on December 18, 2000. His ashes were committed to the sea the following year from the destroyer HMCS Ile de Quebec. A park in Bedford, Nova Scotia, now bears his name. On September 18, 2014, the Royal Canadian Navy announced that its new class of Arctic and offshore patrol vessels would be named the Harry DeWolf class. The first of them, HMCS Harry DeWolf, was launched on September 15, 2018, and delivered to the Navy on July 31, 2020. 6 ships in total are being built. Hard over Harry's name now sails the Northwest Passage that he, as a young officer, would never have seen a Canadian warship enter. On May 26, 2018, at Pier 9 in Hamilton, the Royal Canadian Navy formally designated Haida its ceremonial flagship. Haida hereditary chiefs were present, and a Haida tribal flag was hoisted aboard her, formalizing a relationship between the nation and the ship that, in 1943, had not yet existed. At her commissioning, she had been a steel ship from an English yard, carrying a First Nations name chosen in a boardroom. 75 years later, she was a gathering place for the nation whose name she bore, for the navy she served, and for a country that had learned, finally, how to keep what it had fought to earn. That is the difference between a ship and a relic. A relic sits. A ship, even moored to a pier on a freshwater harbour, keeps teaching. Schoolchildren walk her decks now. Sea cadets stand watch. The noonday gun fires over Hamilton Harbour in the summers. In a country that has, by reputation, no strong sense of its military past, Haida is the one warship every serving Canadian sailor has heard of. Her silhouette is recognized in Newcastle and in Gdynia, where she is twinned with the Polish destroyer Błyskawica that fought beside her off Lorient. There is a final line to draw, and it is simple. No other warship in the history of the Royal Canadian Navy sank more enemy surface tonnage than Haida. The record is closed. It was set in 8 months, in 1944, by a ship commanded, for most of that period, by a seasick Nova Scotian who turned his ship toward his wounded instead of away from them, and who took 4 twin gun mounts and a torpedo tube into every fight the Channel would give him. From a name chosen in an Ottawa office to a flag hoisted by hereditary chiefs on the 75th anniversary of her commissioning, from a midnight arrival at Pier 6 to a dawn arrival at Pier 9, from the Ile de Batz to the rail tunnels of Rewrote, Haida carries a thread of continuity no other Canadian warship has earned. She is the ship that would not leave her own men in the water. She is the ship that could be sent alone against a class that outweighed her and come back with the enemy on the bottom. She is the ship that sailed around the world twice, serving a country that, 2 wars earlier, had not been sure whether it needed a navy at all. The fightingest ship in Canada's naval history is still afloat. That, perhaps, is the most Canadian part of the story. The veterans kept her, the sea cadets crew her, the Crown recognizes her. And the sea, the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay, and the Korean coast and the Lake Ontario shore, has not yet had the last word on Her Majesty's Canadian ship Haida.